Chapter 43. It was a struggle to fit 5 people into the Simca sink. Ruby and Jelly sat on the rudimentary back seat. Paul drove. Greta took the front passenger seat, and Flick sat on Greta's lap. Ordinarily, they would have giggled about it, but they were in a somber mood. They had killed 3 people, and they had come close to being captured by the Gestapo. Now they were watchful, hyper-alert, ready to react fast to anything that happened. They had nothing on their minds but survival. Flick guided Paul to the street parallel with Gilbert's. Flick remembered coming here with her wounded husband exactly 7 days ago. She directed Paul to park near the end of the alley. "Wait here," Flick said. "I'll check the place." Jelly said, "Be quick, for God's sake." "Quick as I can." Flick got out and ran down the alley. Past the back of the factory to the door in the wall. She crossed the garden quickly and slipped through the back entrance into the building. The hallway was empty, and the place was quiet. She went softly up the stairs to the attic floor. She stopped outside Gilbert's apartment. What she saw filled her with dismay. The door stood open. It had been broken in, and was leaning drunkenly from one hinge. She listened but heard nothing, and something told her the break-in had happened days ago. Cautiously, she stepped inside. There had been a perfunctory search. In the little living room, the cushions on the seats were disarranged, and in the kitchen corner, the cupboard doors stood open. Flick looked into the bedroom and saw a similar scene. The drawers had been pulled out of its chest, the wardrobe was open, and someone had stood on the bed with dirty boots. She went to the window and looked down into the street. Parked opposite the building was a black Citroen traction Avant with 2 men sitting in the front. This is all bad news, Flick thought despairingly. Someone had talked, and Dieter Frank had made the most of it. He had painstakingly followed a trail that had led him first to Mademoiselle Lemus, then to Brian Standish, and finally to Gilbert. And Miguel? Was he in custody? It seemed all too probable. She thought about Dieter Frank. She had felt a shiver of fear the first time she had looked at the short MI6 biography of him on the back of his filed photo. She had not been scared enough. She now knew he was clever and persistent. He had almost caught her at La Châtelle. He had scattered posters of her face all over Paris. He had captured and interrogated her comrades one after another. She had set her eyes on him just twice, both times for a few moments only. She brought his face to mind. There was intelligence and energy in his look, she thought, plus a determination that could easily become ruthlessness. She was quite sure that he was still on her trail. She resolved to be ever more vigilant. She looked at the sky. She had about 3 hours until dark. She hurried down the stairs and out through the garden back to the Simca sink, parked in the next street. "No good," she said, as she squeezed into the car. "The place has been searched, and the Gestapo are watching the front." "Hell," Paul said. "Where do we go now?" "I know of one more place to try," said Flick. "Drive into town." She wondered how long they could continue to use the Simca sink, as the tiny 500cc engine struggled to power the overloaded car. Assuming the bodies at the house in the Rue du Bois had been discovered within an hour, how long would it be before police and Gestapo men in Reims were alerted to look out for Mademoiselle Lemes's car? Deirdre had no way of contacting men who were already out on the streets. But at the next change of shift, they would all be briefed, and Flick did not know when the night crews came on duty. She concluded that she had almost no time left. "Drive to the station," she said. "We'll dump the car there." "Good idea," Paul said. "Maybe they'll think we've left town." Flick scanned the streets for military Mercedes cars, or black gendarmes patrolling. But they reached the center of the city without incident. Paul parked near the railway station, and they all got out and hurried away from the incriminating vehicle. "I'll have to do this alone," Flick said. "The rest of you had better go to the cathedral and wait for me there." "All my sins have been forgiven several times over. I've spent so much time in church today," Paul said. "You can pray for a place to spend the night," Flick told him, and she hurried away. She returned to the street where Michael lived. 100 meters from his house was the Bar Zej Regis. Flick went in. The proprietor, Alexandre Regis, sat behind the counter, smoking. He gave her a nod of recognition, but said nothing. She went through the door marked toilets. She walked along a short passage, then opened what looked like a cupboard door. It led to a steep staircase going up. At the top of the stairs was a heavy door with a peephole. Flick banged on it and stood where her face could be. Seen through the Judas, a moment later the door was opened by Meme Regis, the mother of the proprietor. Flick entered a large room whose windows were blacked out. It was crudely decorated, with matting on the floor, brown painted walls, and several naked bulbs hanging from the ceiling. At one end of the room was a roulette wheel. Around a large circular table, a group of men were playing cards. There was a bar in one corner. This was an illegal gambling club. Michael liked to play poker for high stakes, and he enjoyed Louch company, so he occasionally came here for an evening. Flick never played, but she sometimes sat and watched the game for an hour. Michael said she brought him luck. It was a good place to hide from the Gestapo, and Flick had been hoping she might find him here. But as she looked from face to face around the room, she was disappointed. "Thank you, Mimi," she said to Alexander's mother. "It's good to see you. How are you?" "Fine. Have you seen my husband?" "Ah, the charming Michael. Not tonight, I regret. The people here did not know Michael was in the resistance." Flick went to the bar and sat on a stool, smiling at the barmaid, a middle-aged woman with bright red lipstick She was Yvette Regis, the wife of Alexander. Have you any scotch? Of course, said Yvette. For those who can afford it, she produced a bottle of Dewar's Right Label and poured a measure. Flick said, I'm looking for Michael. I haven't seen him for a week or so, Yvette said. Damn. Flick sipped her drink. I'll wait a while in case he shows up. Chapter 44. Dieter was desperate. Flick had proved too clever. She had evaded his trap. She was somewhere in the city of Reims, but he had no way of finding her. He could no longer have members of the Reims resistance followed, in the hope that she would contact one of them, for they were all now in custody. Dieter had Mikhail's house and Gilbert's flat under surveillance, but he felt sure that Flick was too wily to let herself be seen by the average Gestapo flatfoot. There were posters of her all over town, but she must have changed her appearance by now, dyed her hair or something, for no one had reported seeing her. She had outwitted him at every stop. He needed a stroke of genius, and he had come up with one, he thought. He sat on the seat of a bicycle at the roadside. He was in the center of town, just outside the theater. He wore a beret, goggles, and a rough cotton sweater, and his trousers were tucked into his socks. He was unrecognizable. No one would suspect him. The Gestapo never went by bicycle. He steered west along the street, narrowing his eyes to look into the setting sun. He was waiting for a black Citroen. He checked his watch. Any minute now. On the other side of the road, Hans was at the rear of a wheezy old Peugeot, which had almost come to the end of its useful life. The engine was running. Dieter did not want to take the risk that it might not start when it was needed. Hans was also disguised in sunglasses and a cap, and wore a shabby suit and down at the heel shoes, like a French citizen. He had never done anything like this before, but he had accepted his orders with unflappable stoicism. Dieter too had never done this before. He had no idea whether it would work. All kinds of things could go wrong, and anything could happen. What Dieter had planned was desperate, but what did he have to lose? Tuesday was the night of the full moon. He felt sure that allies were about to invade her. Flick was the grand prize. She was worth a great deal of risk. But winning the war was no longer what most occupied his mind. His future had been wrecked. He hardly cared who ruled Europe. He thought constantly of Flick Clariette. She had ruined his life. She had murdered Stephanie. He wanted to find Flick and capture her, and take her to the basement of the chateau. There he would taste the satisfaction of revenge. He fantasized constantly about how he would torture her. The iron rods that would smash her small bones, the electric shock machine turned up to maximum, the injections that would render her helpless with great wrenching spasms of nausea, the ice bath that would give her shivering convulsions and freeze the blood in her fingers, destroying the resistance and repelling the invaders, had become merely part of his punishment of Flick. But first he had to find her. In the distance he saw a black Centurion. He stared at it. Was this the one? It was a two-door model, the kind always used when transporting a prisoner. He tried to see inside. He thought there were 4 people altogether. This had to be the car he was waiting for. It drew nearer, and he recognized the handsome face of Mikhail in the back. Guarded by a uniformed Gestapo man, he tensed. He was glad now that he had given orders that Mikhail was not to be tortured while Dieter was away. This scheme would not have been possible otherwise. As the Centurion came level with Dieter, Hans suddenly pulled away from the curb in the old PU. The car swung out into the road, leaped forward, and smashed straight into the front of the Centurion. There was a clatter of crumpling metal and a medley of breaking glass. The 2 Gestapo men leaped out of the front of the Centurion and began yelling at Hans in bad French, seeming not to notice that their colleague in the back appeared to have banged his head and was slumped, apparently unconscious, besides his prisoner. This was the critical moment, Dieter thought, his nerves strung like wire. Would Mikhail take the bait? He stared at the tableau in the middle of the street. It took Michael a long moment to realize his opportunity. Dieter almost thought he would fail to seize it. Then he seemed to come to. He reached over the front seats, fumbled at the door catch with bound hands, succeeded in getting the door open, pushed down the seat, and scrambled out. He glanced at the 2 Gestapo men still arguing with Hans. They had their backs to him. He turned and walked quickly away. His expression said he could hardly believe his good luck. Dieter's heart leaped with triumph. His plan was working. He followed Mikhail. Hans followed Dieter on foot. Dieter rode the bicycle for a few yards. Then he found himself catching up with Mikhail. So he got off and pushed it along the pavement. Mikhail turned the first corner, limping slightly from his bullet wound but walking fast, holding his bound hands low in front of him to make them less conspicuous. Dieter followed discreetly, sometimes walking, sometimes riding, dropping back out of Mikhail's sight whenever he could, taking cover behind high-sided vehicles if he got the chance. Mikhail occasionally glanced back, but made no systematic attempt to shake off a tail. He had no notion that he was being tricked. After a few minutes, Hans overtook Dieter by arrangement, and Dieter dropped back to follow Hans. Then they switched again. Where would Mikhail go? It was essential to Dieter's plan that Mikhail should lead him to other resistance members, so that he could once again pick up Flix's trail. To Dieter's surprise, Mikhail headed for his house near the cathedral. Surely he must suspect that his home was under surveillance. Nevertheless, he turned into the street. However, he did not go to his own place, but entered a bar across the street called Chez Riguez. Dieter leaned his bicycle against the wall of the next building, a vacant store with a faded charcuterie sign. He waited a few minutes, just in case Mikhail should come out again immediately. When it was clear Mikhail was staying a while, Dieter went in. He intended simply to make sure Mikkel was still there. Relying on his goggles and beret to conceal his identity from Mikkel, he would buy a pack of cigarettes as an excuse and go back outside, but Mikkel was nowhere in sight. Puzzled, Dieter hesitated. The barman said, "Yes, sir." "Beer," said Dieter. "Draft." He hoped that if he kept his conversation to a minimum, the barman would not notice his slight German accent and accept him as a cyclist who had stopped to quench his thirst. Coming up. Where's the toilet? The barman pointed to a door in the corner. Dieter went through it. Michael was not in the men's room. Dieter risked a glance into the ladies'. It was empty. He opened what looked like a cupboard door and saw that it led to a staircase. He went up the stairs. At the top was a heavy door with a peephole. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He listened for a moment. He could hear nothing, but the door was thick. He felt sure there was someone on the other side, looking at him through the peephole. Realizing he was not a regular customer, he tried to act as if he had taken a wrong turn on the way to the toilet. He scratched his head, shrugged, and went back down the stairs. There was no sign of a back entrance to the place. Mikkel was here. Dieter felt sure, in the locked room upstairs. But what should Dieter do about it? He took his glass to a table so that the barman would not try to engage him in small talk. The beer was watery and tasteless. Even in Germany, the quality of beer had declined during the war. He forced himself to finish it, then went out. Hans was on the other side of the street, looking in the window of a bookshop. Dieter went across. "He's in some kind of private room upstairs," he told Hans. "He may be meeting with other resistance cadres. On the other hand, it may be a brothel or something, and I don't want to bust in on him before he's led us to anyone worthwhile." Hans nodded, understanding the dilemma. Dieter made a decision. It was too soon to rearrest Mikkel. "When he comes out, I'll follow him. As soon as we're out of sight, you can raid the place. On my own?" Dieter pointed to two Gestapo men in the Citroen, keeping watch on Mikkel's house. "Get them to help you." "Okay." "Try to make it look like a vice thing. Arrest the whores if there are any. Don't mention the resistance." "Okay. Until then, re-rate." Chapter 45. Until the moment when Mikkel walked in, Flick was feeling pessimistic. She sat at the bar in the little makeshift casino, making desultory conversation with Yvette, indifferently watching the intent faces of the men as they concentrated on their cards, their dice, and the spinning roulette wheel. No one took much notice of her. They were serious gamblers, not to be distracted by a pretty face. If she did not find Mikkel, she was in trouble. The other Jackdaws were in the cathedral, but they could not stay there all night. They could sleep in the open, they would survive the weather in June, but they could so easily be caught. They also needed transport. If they could not get a car or van from the Bollinger Circuit, they would have to steal one, but then they would be forced to carry out the mission using a vehicle for which the police was searching. It added more dangers to an already perilous enterprise. There was another reason for her gloom. The image of Stephanie Vincent kept coming back to her. It was the first time Flick had killed a bound, helpless captive, and the first time she had shot a woman. Any killing disturbed her profoundly. The Gestapo men she had shot a few minutes before Stephanie had been a combatant with a gun in his hand, but still it seemed dreadful to her that she had brought his life to an end. So it had been with the other men she had killed. 2 milice cops in Paris, a Gestapo colonel in Lille, and a French traitor in Rouen. But Stephanie was worse. Flick had put a gun to the back of her head and executed her. It was exactly how she had taught trainees to do it in the SOE course. Stephanie had deserved it, of course. Flick had no doubt about that. But she wondered about herself. What kind of person was capable of the cold-blooded killing of a helpless prisoner? Had she become some kind of brutish executioner? She drained her whiskey, but declined a refill for fear of becoming maudlin. Then Mikhail came through the door. Overwhelming relief flooded her. Mikhail knew everyone in town. He would be able to help her. Suddenly, the mission seemed possible again. She felt a wry affection as she took in the lanky figure in a rumpled jacket, the handsome face with the smiling eyes. She would always be fond of him. She imagined she suffered a painful stab of regret as she thought of the passionate love she had once had for him. That would never come back, she was sure. As he came closer, she saw that he was not looking so good. His face seemed to have new lines. Her heart filled with compassion for him. Exhaustion and fear showed in his expression, and he might have been 50 rather than 35. She thought anxiously, but her greatest anxiety came from the thought of telling him that their marriage was over. She was afraid. It struck her as ironic. She had just shot and killed a Gestapo man and a French traitress, and she was undercover in occupied territory. Yet her worst fear was of hurting her husband's feelings. He was visibly delighted to see her. "Flick," he cried, "I knew you would get here." He crossed the room to her, still limping from his bullet wound. She said quietly, "I was afraid the Gestapo had captured you." "They did." He turned so that his back was to the room, and no one could see, and showed her his hands, bound at the wrist with stout rope. She drew the little knife from its sheath under her lapel, and discreetly cut through his bonds. The gamblers saw nothing. She put the knife away. Mime Regis spotted him just as he was stuffing the ropes into his trousers pockets. She embraced and kissed him on both cheeks. Flick watched him flirt with the older woman, talking to her in his come-to-bed voice, giving her the benefit of his sexy grin. Then Mime resumed her work, serving drinks to the gamblers, and Mikhail told Flick how he had escaped. She had been afraid he would want to kiss her passionately, and she had not known how she would deal with that. But in the event, he He was too full of his own adventures to get romantic with her. "I was so lucky," he finished. He sat on a bar stool, rubbing his wrist, and asked for a beer. Flick nodded. "Too lucky, perhaps," she said. "What do you mean?" "It could be some kind of trick." He was indignant, no doubt resenting the implication that he was gullible. "I don't think so." "Could you have been followed here?" "No," he said firmly. "I checked, of course." She was uneasy, but she let it go. "Sir Brian Standish is dead, and 3 others are in custody. Mademoiselle Lemus, Gilbert, and Dr. Bowler. The rest are dead. The Germans released the bodies of those killed in the skirmish, and the survivors Gaston, Genevieve, and Bertrand were shot by a firing squad in the square at Sainte-Cécile. Dear God!" They were silent for a moment. Flick was weighed down by the thought of the lives lost, and the suffering endured. For the sake of this mission, Mikhail's beer came. He drank half in a single draught, and wiped his lips. "I presume you've come back for another attempt on the chateau." She nodded. "But the cover story is that we are going to blow up the railway tunnels at Marles." "It's a good idea. We should do it anyway." "Not now. 2 of my men were taken in Paris, and they must have talked. They will have told the cover story. They had no idea of the real mission. And the Germans are sure to have doubled the guard on the railway tunnel. We'll leave that to the RAF and concentrate on Sainte-Cécile. What can I do?" "We need somewhere to stay the night." He thought for a moment. "Joseph Laperriere's cellar." Laperriere was a champagne maker. Mikhail's aunt Antoinette had once been his secretary. "Is he one of us? A sympathizer?" He gave a sour grin. "Everyone is a sympathizer now. They all think the invasion is coming any day." He looked inquiringly at her. "I imagine they're right about that." "Yes," she said. She did not elaborate. "How big is the cellar?" "There are 5 of us." "It's big." "He could hide 50 people down there." "Fine. The other thing I need is a vehicle for tomorrow." "To drive to Sainte-Cécile?" "And afterwards. To meet our pickup plane, if we are still alive. You realize that you can't use the usual drop zones at Châtel, don't you? The Gestapo know about it. It's where I was picked up. Yes, the plane is coming to the other one at La Rouque. I gave instructions. The potato field? Good. And the vehicle?" "Philip Moliere has a van. He delivers meat to all the German bases. Monday is his day off." "I remember him. He's pro-Nazi." "He was. And he's been making money out of them for 4 years. So now he's terrified that the invasion is going to succeed, and after the Germans have gone, he'll be strung up as a collaborator. He's desperate to do something to help us, to prove he's not a traitor. He'll lend us his van." "Bring it to the cellar tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning." He touched her cheek. "Can't we spend the night together?" He smiled his old smile and looked as roguishly handsome as ever. She felt a familiar stirring inside, but it was not as strong as it had been in the old days. Once that smile would have made her wet. Now it was like the memory of a desire. She wanted to tell him the truth, for she hated to do anything less than honest. But it might jeopardize the mission. She needed his cooperation. Or was that just an excuse? Perhaps she just did not have the nerve. No, she said. We can't spend the night together. He looked crestfallen. Is it because of Gilbert? She nodded, but she could not lie, and she found herself saying, well, possibly. What's the other part? I don't really want to have this discussion in the middle of an important mission. He looked vulnerable, almost scared. Have you got someone else? She could not bring herself to hurt him. No, she lied. He looked hard at her. Good, he said at last. I'm glad. Flick hated herself. Mikhail finished his beer and got off his stool. La Prairie's place is in the Chenin de la Carrière. It will take you 30 minutes to walk there. I know the street. I'd better go and see Molière about the van. He put his arms around Flick and kissed her lips. She felt dreadful. She could hardly refuse the kiss, having denied that she had someone else, but kissing Mikhail seemed so disloyal to Paul. She closed her eyes and waited passively until he broke the clinch. He could not fail to notice her lack of enthusiasm. He looked thoughtfully at her for a moment. I'll see you at 10, he said, and he left. She decided to give him 5 minutes to get clear before she followed him out. She asked Yvette for another scotch. While she was sipping it, a red light began to flash over the door. No one spoke, but everyone in the room moved at once. The croupier stopped the roulette wheel and turned it upside down so that it looked like a normal tabletop. The card players swept up their stakes and put on their jacket. Yvette picked up the glasses from the bar and dumped them in the sink. Memory just turned out the lights, leaving the room illuminated only by the flashing red bulb over the door. Flick picked up her bag from the floor and put her hand on her gun. What's happening? She asked Yvette. Police raid, she said. Flick cursed. What hellish luck it would be to get arrested for illegal gambling. Alexandre downstairs has given us the warning. Yvette explained. Get going quickly. She pointed across the room. Flick looked in the direction Yvette indicated and saw Memory just stepping into what looked like a cupboard as she watched. Memes shoved aside a couple of old coats hanging from a rail to reveal at the back of the cupboard a door which she hurriedly opened. The gamblers began to leave by the hidden door. Maybe Flick thought she could get away. The flashing red light went out, and a banging began on the main door. Flick crossed the room in the dark and joined the men pushing through the cupboard. She followed the crowd into a bare room. The floor was about a foot lower than she expected, and she guessed this was the apartment over the shop next door. They all ran down the stairs, and sure enough, she found herself in the disused cafeteria with a stained marble counter and dusty glass cases. The blind in the front window was drawn down so that no one could see in from the street. They all went out through the back door. There was a dirty yard surrounded by a high wall. A door in the wall led to an alley, and the alley led to the next street. When they reached the street, the men went in different directions. Flick walked quickly away, and soon found herself alone. Breathing hard, she reoriented herself and headed for the cathedral, where the other jackdaws were waiting. My God, she whispered to herself, that was close. As she got her breath back, she began to see the raid on the gambling club in a different light. It had happened just minutes after Mika had left. Flick did not believe in coincidence. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that whoever was banging on the door had been looking for her. She knew that a small group of men had been playing for high stakes in that room since before the war. The local police certainly knew about the place. Why would they suddenly decide to close it down? If not the police, it must have been the Gestapo. And they were not really interested in gamblers. They went after communists, Jews, homosexuals, and spies. The story of Michael's escape had aroused her suspicion from the start, but she had been partly reassured by his insistence that he had not been followed. Now she thought otherwise. His escape must have been faked, like the rescue of Brian Standish. She saw the sly Brian of Dieter Frank behind this. Someone had followed Mikkel to the cafe, guessed at the existence of the secret upstairs room, and hoped to find her there. In that case, Mikkel was still under surveillance. If he continued to be careless, he would be trailed to Philip Moliere's house tonight. And in the morning, driving the van, he would be followed to the champagne cellar, where the Jackdaws were hiding. And what the hell, Flick thought, am I going to do about that? The 9th day, Monday, June 5th, 1944. Chapter 46. Dieter's migraine began shortly after midnight, as he stood in his room at the Hotel Frankfurt, looking at the bed he would never again share with Stephanie. He felt that if he could sleep, the pain would fade, but no tears came, and he injected himself with morphine, and collapsed on the counterpane. The phone woke him before daylight. It was Walter Godel, Rommel's aide. Groggily, Dieter said, "Has the invasion begun?" "Not today," Godel replied. "The weather is bad in the English Channel." Dieter sat upright and shook his head to clear it. What then? The resistance were clearly expecting something. Overnight there has been an eruption of sabotage throughout northern France. Godel's voice, already cool, descended to an Arctic chill. It was supposed to be your job to prevent that. What are you doing in bed? Caught off guard, Dieter struggled to gain his usual poise. I'm right on the tail of the most important of all resistance leaders, he said, trying hard not to sound as if he was making excuses for failure. I almost caught her last night. I'll arrest her today. Don't worry. By tomorrow morning, we'll be rounding up terrorists by the hundreds. I promise you. He immediately regretted the pleading tone of the last 3 words. Godel was unmoved. After tomorrow, it will probably be too late. I know. Dieter stopped. The line was dead. Godel had hung up. Dieter cradled the phone and looked at his wristwatch. It was 4 o'clock. He got up. His migraine had gone, but he felt queasy, either from the morphine or the unpleasant phone call. He drank a glass of water and swallowed 3 aspirins, then began to shave. As he lathered his face, he nervously ran over the events of the previous evening, asking himself if he had done everything possible. Leaving Lieutenant Hess outside Rodriguez, he had followed Michael Creriet to the premise of Philip Moliere, a supplier of fresh meat to restaurants and military kitchens. It was a storefront property, with living quarters above and a yard at the side. Dieter had watched the place for an hour, but no one had come out. Deciding that Mikkel intended to spend the night there, Dieter had found a bar and phoned Hans Hess. Hans had got on a motorcycle and joined him outside the Moliere place at 10. The lieutenant told Dieter the story of the inexplicably empty room above Rodriguez's. "There's some early warning system," Dieter speculated. "This barman downstairs is ready to sound the alarm if anyone comes looking." "You think the resistance were using the place?" "Probably. I guess the Communist Party used to hold meetings there, and the resistance took over the system. But how did they get away last night?" "A trapdoor under the carpet? Something like that. The Communists would have been prepared for trouble." "Did you arrest the barman?" "I arrested everyone in the place. They're at the chateau now." Dieter had left Hans watching the Moliere property and had driven to Saint-Cecile. There he questioned the terrified proprietor, Alexandre Regis, and learned within minutes that his speculation had been off target. The place was neither a resistance hideout nor a communist meeting place, but an illegal gambling club. Nevertheless, Alexandre confirmed that Michael Creriet had gone there last night, and he said Michael had met his wife there. It was another maddening near miss for Dieter. He had captured one resistance member after another, but Flick always eluded him. Now he finished shaving, wiped his face, and phoned the chateau to order a car with a driver and 2 Gestapo men to pick him up. He got dressed and went to the hotel kitchen to bake 6 warm croissants, which he had wrapped in a linen napkin. Then he went out into the cool of the early morning. The towers of the cathedral were silvered by the breaking dawn, when the fast centurion favored by the Gestapo was rating. He gave the driver the address of the Moliere place. He found Hans looking in the warehouse doorway 50 meters along the street. No one had come or gone all night. Hans said so Mikkel must still be inside. Dieter told his driver to wait around the next corner, then stood with Hans, sharing the croissants and watching the sun come up over the roofs of the city. They had a long wait. Dieter fought to control his impatience as the minutes and hours ticked away uselessly. The loss of Stephanie weighed on his heart, but he had recovered from the immediate shock, and he had regained his interest in the war. He thought of the Allied forces massing somewhere in the south or east of England, shiploads of men and tanks eager to turn the quiet seaside towns of northern France into battlefields. He thought of the French saboteurs, armed to the teeth thanks to parachute drops of guns, ammunitions, and explosives, ready to attack the German defenders. From behind, to stab them in the back and fatally cramped Rommel's ability to maneuver. He felt foolish and impotent, standing in the doorway in Reims, waiting for an amateur terrorist to finish his breakfast. Today, perhaps, he would be led into the very heart of the resistance, but all he had was hope. It was after 9 o'clock when the front door opened. At last, Dieter breathed. He moved back from the sidewalk, making himself inconspicuous. Hans put out his cigarette. Mikkel came out of the building accompanied by a boy of about 17, who Dieter guessed might be a son of Molière. The lad keyed a padlock and opened the gates of the yard. In the yard was a clean black van with white lettering on the side that read Molière and Fils. Viandes. Michael got in. Dieter was electrified. Michael was borrowing a meat delivery van. It had to be for the Jackdaws. "Let's go," he said. Hans hurried to his motorcycle, which was parked at the curb, and stood with his back to the road, pretending to fiddle with the engine. Dieter ran to the corner, signaled the Gestapo driver to start the car, then watched Mikkel. Mikkel drove out of the yard and headed away. Hans started his motorcycle and followed. Dieter jumped into the car and ordered the driver to follow Hans. They headed east. Dieter in the front passenger seat of the Gestapo's black Citroën looked ahead anxiously. Molier's van was easy to follow, having a high roof with a vent on top like a chimney. "That little vent will lead me to Flick." Dieter thought optimistically. The van slowed in the Chemin de la Carrière and pulled into the yard of a champagne house called La Prairie. Hans drove past and turned the next corner, and Dieter's driver followed. They pulled up, and Dieter leaped out. "I think the Jackdaws hide out there overnight," Dieter said. "Shall we raid the place?" Hans said eagerly. Dieter pondered. This was the dilemma he had faced yesterday, outside the cafe. Flick might be in there, but if he moved too quickly, he might prematurely end Mikkel's usefulness as a stalking horse. "Not yet," he said. Mikkel was the only hope he had left. It was too soon to risk losing that weapon. Real rate. Dieter and Hans walked to the end of the street and watched the La Prairie's place from the corner. There was a tall, elegant house, a courtyard full of empty barrels, and a low industrial building with a flat roof. Dieter guessed the cellars ran beneath the flat-roofed building. Molier's van was parked in the yard. Dieter's pulse was racing. Any moment now, Mikkel would reappear with Flick and the other Jackdaws, he guessed. They would get into the van, ready to drive to their target, and Dieter and the Gestapo would move in and arrest them. As I watched, Mikkel came out of the low building. He wore a frown and he stood indecisively in the yard, looking around him in a perplexed fashion. Hans said, "What's the matter with him?" Dieter's heart sank. Something he didn't expect. Surely Flick had not evaded him again. After a minute, Mikkel climbed the short flight of steps to the door of the house and knocked. A maid in a little white cap let him in. He came out again a few minutes later. He still looked puzzled, but he was no longer indecisive. He walked to the van, got in, and turned it around. Dieter cursed. It seemed the Jackdaws were not here. Mikhail appeared just as surprised as Dieter was. But that was small consolation. Dieter had to find out what had happened here. He said to Hans, "We'll do the same as last night. Only this time you follow Mikhail and I'll raid the place." Hans started his motorcycle. Dieter watched Mikhail drive away in Mulia's van. Followed at a discreet distance by Hans' motorcycle. When they were out of sight, he summoned the 3 Gestapo men with a wave and walked quickly to the Laprairies' house. He pointed at the two of the men. "Check the house. Make sure no one leaves." Nodding at the 3rd man, he said, "You and I will search the winery." He led the way into the low building. On the ground floor there was a large grape press and 3 enormous vats. The press was pristine. The harvest was 3 or 4 months away. There was no one present but an old man sweeping the floor. Dieter found the stairs and ran down. In the cool underground chamber there was more activity. Racked bottles were being turned by a handful of blue-coated workers. They stopped and stared at the intruders. Dieter and the Gestapo man searched room after room of bottles of champagne, thousands of them, some stacked against the walls, others racked slantwise, with the necks down in special A-shaped frames. But there were no women anywhere. In an alcove at the far end of the last tunnel, Dieter found crumbs of bread, cigarette ends, and a hair clip. His worst fears were dismally confirmed. The Jackdaws had spent the night here, but they had escaped. He cast about for focus for his anger. The workers would probably knew nothing about the Jackdaws, but the owner must have given permission for them to hide here. He would suffer for it. Dieter returned to the ground floor, crossed the yard, and went to the house. A Gestapo man opened the door. "They're all in the front room," he said. Dieter entered a large, spacious room with elegant but shabby furnishings, heavy curtains that had not been cleaned for years, a worn carpet, a long dining table, and a matching set of 12 chairs. The terrified household staff were standing at the near end of the room. The maid who opened the door, an elderly man who looked like a butler in his threadbare black suit, and a plump woman wearing an apron, who must have been the cook. A Gestapo man held a pistol pointed at them. At the far end of the table sat a thin woman of about 50, with red hair threaded with silver, dressed in a summer frock of pale yellow silk. She had an air of calm superiority. Dieter turned to the Gestapo man and said in a low voice, "Where's the husband?" "He left the house at 8. They don't know where he went. He's expected home for lunch." Dieter gave the woman a hard look. "Madame Laprairie," she nodded gravely, but did not deign to speak. Dieter decided to puncture her dignity. Some German officers behaved with deference to upper-class French people, but Dieter thought they were fools. He would not pander to her by walking the length of the room to speak to her. "Bring her to me," he said. One of the men spoke to her. Slowly she got up from her chair and approached Deirdre. "What do you want?" she said. "A group of terrorists from England escaped from me yesterday after killing 2 German officers and a French woman civilian." "I'm sorry to hear that," said Madame La Prairie. "They tied the woman up and shot her in the back of the head at point-blank range," he went on. "Her brains spilled out onto her dress." She closed her eyes and turned her head aside. Deirdre went on. "Last night your husband sheltered those terrorists in your cellar. Can you think of any reason why he should not be hanged?" Behind him the maid began to cry. Madame La Prairie was shaken. Her face turned pale, and she sat down suddenly. "No, please," she whispered. Deirdre said, "You can help your husband by telling me what you know." "I don't know anything," she said in a low voice. "They came after dinner, and they left before dawn. I never saw them." "How did they leave? Did your husband provide them with a car?" She shook her head. "We have no gas." "Then how do you deliver the champagne you make? Our customers have to come to us." Deirdre did not believe her. He felt sure Flick needed transportation. That was why Michael had borrowed a van from Philip Morier and brought it here. Yet when Michael got here, Flick and the Jackdaws had gone. They must have found an alternative means of transport and decided to go on ahead. No doubt Flick had left a message explaining the situation and telling Michael to catch up with her. Deirdre said, "Are you asking me to believe they left here on foot?" "No," she replied. "I'm telling you that I don't know. When I woke up, they had gone." Deirdre still thought she was lying, but to get the truth out of her would take time and patience, and he was running out of both. "Arrest them all," he said, and his angry frustration injected a petulant note into his voice. The phone rang into the hall. Deirdre stepped out of the dining room and picked it up. A voice with a German accent said, "Let me speak to Major Frank." "This is he." "Lieutenant Hess here, Major." "Hans, what happened?" "I'm at the station. Mikkel parked the van and brought a ticket to Mars. The train is about to leave." It was as Deirdre had thought. The Jackdaws had gone ahead and left instructions for Mikkel to join them. They were still planning to blow up the railway tunnel. He felt frustrated that Flick was continuing to stay one step ahead of him. However, she had not been able to escape him completely. He was still on her tail. He would catch her soon. "Get on the train quickly," he said to Hans. "Stay with him. I'll meet you at Mars." "Very good," said Hans, and he hung up. Deirdre returned to the dining room. "Call the chateau and have them send transportation," he said to the Gestapo man. "Turn all the prisoners over to Sergeant Becker for interrogation. Tell him to start with Madame." He pointed to the driver. "You can drive me to Mars."